Mr. Taleblu, demonstrations have been going on in Iran for more than 2 months now, resulting in a deadly clampdown from the authorities. The protests were caused by the death of Mahsa Amini, who died in September after being detained by the country's morality police. Some analysts argued that even though current protests have spread quickly among many socioeconomic levels in many parts of the country, because there's no formal organization or leadership for the movement, it's not likely to bring about any fundamental changes in Iran and will eventually subdue as a result of government repression. What is your take on that?
So there's a couple of important facts here. One is that with a regime like the Islamic Republic that is both Islamist and authoritarian, and a society like the Iranian population, which is secular nationalist and seeking some kind of representative government, those two things do not mix in this cocktail. And that's why whether these protests end tomorrow, God forbid, or whether they, years from now end up in some kind of successful regime change scenario, it just tells you that there will be more instability to come, regardless of the current pattern of street protests. And in particular, if they're amplified by strikes, which again, this combination of streets and strikes was what was essential in bringing down the previous government in Iran in 1979. So with all of that aside, the lack of organization is both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because the Islamic Republic cannot quell these protests permanently because there is no cohesive, organized, centralized leadership. But on the other hand, it's a curse because the gains made from street power, for instance, removing security forces from some areas, for instance, having 2.5 months of consistent protests in some of Iran's provinces, all of that may not be able to be translated in the short term, at least, into a political success, and will force them to have to stay on the streets longer to achieve political success. So it's both a curse and a blessing. But right now, all one can do is really take their hat off at the strength and the resolve of the Iranian people, because they know they're losing life and limb. And there have been protests in all of Iran's 31 provinces. And so people of different backgrounds, ethnic and sectarian composition, are seeing events the same way. And that, of course, is a powerful thing to watch, particularly from this far abroad.
Some researchers and analysts are saying that previously major protests in Iran occurred very rarely, maybe once in a decade, but they have become more frequent in the past few years, and they expect that if there aren't major changes during the current wave of protests and the government is able to suppress them, they will become even more frequent, which will be a major challenge for the leadership. Do you agree?
Frequency is a key pillar or key vector of change in the evolving pattern of street protests against the Islamic Republic. The Islamic Republic has been around for 43 years, and there have been street protests against the Islamic Republic for 43 years. But what differentiates the wave of national protests we've seen in Iran from late 2017 until present is, again, the frequency, the demography, the geography, the level of violence by the state against the street, and of course, the nature of the slogan. So the population is fundamentally done with reform. The pattern of street protests, unlike 1999 and 2009, no longer have to begin in Tehran to have political saliency. And ultimately, the time period between these protests is shrinking drastically. There was almost a decade between 2009 and 2017. There was a decade between 1999 and 2009, but there was mere months between the November 2019 protests that were triggered by energy subsidy cuts and the protests in 2020 when the Islamic Republic downed a civilian airliner, killing of 176 innocent passengers. So regardless of the level of violence by the state against the street, the period of time between these protests is shrinking. And the current protests that we see now, triggered in September 2022, are actually the second round of national protests against the regime. The first round we saw, again, starting in the country's southwest in May.
Current protests in Iran started after the death of Iranian Kurdish woman Mahsa Amini while in the custody of the country's so-called morality police. While the protests first originated in the Kurdish region of Iran, they've quickly spread to other parts of the country, including areas home to other large ethnic minority populations such as Baluchis and Azerbaijanis. According to rights groups, the government has focused its crackdown mostly on these regions, and majority of the deaths were recorded in regions with ethnic minorities. How would you describe the reason behind this?
So this is a critical thing not to miss in the current pattern of street protests in the Islamic Republic and the larger center versus periphery story in modern Iranian history. While Iran is ethnically and religiously quite a diverse country, when the entire population saw what happened between September 13 and September 16 to Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old Iranian Kurdish woman who was visiting the capital and who was detained and who was brutally beaten and ultimately died, due to wounds that she had sustained from Iran's quote-unquote morality police and security forces. People of those different ethnic and sectarian backgrounds saw those events the same way, and that's why it had political saliency to spark over 2.5 months of protests in all of Iran's 31 provinces, with over 140 different cities, towns, and villages, and over 150 different educational institutions, including colleges, universities, and even high schools in some of the most rural areas across the Iranian state today. So with all of that in mind and all of that wave of nationalist protest against the Islamic Republic, the regime has doubled down on tried and true methods. We know it already discriminates against ethnic and sectarian minorities. It's in many cases institutionalized some of that discrimination. And that's why you've seen some of the heaviest pushback by the state against the street in areas, again, where you mentioned where there are ethnic and sectarian minorities. And in fact, in an attempt to break up the consistent nationwide pattern of protests and to make it look like indeed something ethnic, sectarian, and related to separatism. And that's precisely why the regime has, when it has looked so weak at home, 3 times now fired into northern Iraq, into Iraqi Kurdistan, taking innocent civilian lives, using weapons of war, using ballistic missiles, all in a bid to distract from the larger nationwide pattern of protests by the street against the state, and to try to pin this again as an ethno-sectarian issue when it clearly isn't.
Iran has already sentenced 6 people to death. However, Amnesty International estimates that there are at least 21 people that are currently on trial with charges that can carry a death penalty. Rights groups and experts expect this number to go up. What, if anything, can the international community do to prevent the Iranian regime from intensifying its repression against protesters?
Well, there's a lot more that, not just Washington, but the international community do to hold the government of the Islamic Republic accountable. And on the one hand, what it needs to do is to shine a light at the most localized of levels, the most localized security forces, naming and shaming and identifying not just military and security officials like the law enforcement forces and the Basij, which are engaging in the crackdowns at the provincial level. And all of this information is open source, and all of it can be used to generate the next wave of sanctions to hopefully punish and deter the government of the Islamic Republic, but also the political and judicial apparatus, the names of the parliamentarians, the names of the governors, the names of the local officials, the names of the people in municipalities supporting the crackdown, and the names of the judicial officials handing out these sentences, making sure their names are known, making sure their personalities are sanctioned, making sure that there are visa bans against them and their families, and making sure that ultimately the full weight of international law does come down against them. I think a more unified, coherent, and consistent message, for instance, by the Western world and the international community would do a lot here to show that the government of the Islamic Republic cannot continue to get away with murder like this. One thing I've been advocating for, and I've noted, unfortunately, is that despite many jurisdictions like the UK, US, EU, Canada, Australia, New Zealand being very good on this issue, and they all have Magnitsky sanctions, not one of these jurisdictions have used Magnitsky sanctions against the government of the Islamic Republic. So it's time for a much more multilateral and coordinated pressure campaign against the Islamic Republic to hold the most localized or the most top elite political, military, security, and judicial officials accountable for all of these, because I'm sure even the death toll, which is estimated now between 420 and 440, I'm sure it's much higher than that.